Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 76th episode of Podcast Demastered. I'm Chelsea, and I'm here with Wade as always. And we have now entered the month of May. And this episode and the next two episodes are all going to be part of like a series celebrating the month of May, which is also Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, or AAPI month. And so our next three episodes are going to be dedicated highlighting different Asian American works, from books to movies to video games. And I know that AAPI month celebrates such a wide and diverse diaspora. So, we're only going to be able to dive in a short little piece, but we're excited to share some things with you guys. Maybe you'll learn something. We would love to hear your suggestions on any things that we might have missed, things we want to cover in the future. But for this episode, we are going to be covering mainly a book, which is Farewell to Manzanar, which is written by Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston and James D. Houston, a husband and wife. And before we kind of dive into this topic, I think discussing that particularly this book, Farewell to Manzanar, I think is probably one of the most popular books on the subject of the unjust incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And this is personally for topic for me that's really near and dear to my heart. I am a Japanese American. I am what's considered a gosei. I'm a fifth generation, so my great-great-grandparents were immigrants from Japan. And this particular situation, in Farewell to Manzanar, is something that is a part of my family history as well. I had 3 generations incarcerated. They were in Amache, which was one of the, quote, internment camps in Colorado. But I feel like we can kind of just dive in a little bit more to this book and kind of a little bit of background, because this is a real part of history. And I think, Wade, I feel at least for me, I remember in school, we kind of covered it a little bit, but I'm not really sure how much, at least in my schooling, we didn't quite dive too much into this topic.
No, it was the same for me. In my history classes, we talked a lot about World War II. And, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, who doesn't talk about those things? But I didn't get any experience on this particular, side of the war. Until an English class I took where we read Farewell to Manzanar. And that was my first experience, knowing that America did this. I had no idea. It was reading through the book was just, for me at the age of 15, 16, whatever I might have been, was just absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because, honestly, Farewell to Manzanar, I actually just read this book for the podcast. This is something that we never had to read in school or anything. What we did do, it was in my English class, we had an excerpt from the book, the first chapter. We had a book that had various books, and that's all we discussed with that. And I think maybe in middle school we kind of briefly touched about it, and history class being World War II, we're going to discuss everything else for months on end, but then we're also going to mention, Japanese Americans were also incarcerated in the United States, and then moved on from that. And I'm like, what?
What?
It's
Hello?
just, yeah, it's, excuse me? So, yeah, it's just a thing that's, I think, even still today, that I think is something that's not quite as talked about, but I feel almost more that there are even more books that are coming out now about this. More people are speaking about on the subject because it's still relevant today in so many ways.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I will mention that this book surprised me because this book is actually really old, Farewell to Manzanar, which makes sense because she is 9 or so in the book?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So Farewell to Manzanar came out in 1973.
That is bonkers.
Yeah. And it's just crazy. And I felt like this is the book that I've either heard about or many people have heard about and maybe never read or did read. And that became the staple of explaining this experience during World War II. Now, Wade, do you want to kind of help what we can explain, kind of in general, the story of the author in this? Because this is considered a memoir, too. This is, a real story about Jeanne's life.
Right, yes. So the story takes place, 41, I think it is, it's kind of vaguely where she starts it. And Jeanne and her family, so her mom, her dad, her grandma, and her 8 siblings, I think it was.
Yeah.
she talks about their life like before the war, and just kind of what it was like being Japanese American like that early. Which at that time for her, I think she talks about how like it wasn't a thing. She was just a normal person living a normal life as any normal kid would. And it wasn't until the start, like the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that people started to look at her because of her race. And before that, her race was never talked about. It was never a problem. Like she wasn't even like in neighborhoods with other people of her race. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and it was just so much ingrained in her family just being like, the American experience. They were just American and just, living just like any other family. And then just, yeah.
Now, like her dad she was a Nisei, right? Second generation. Like her dad was from Japan. Like her mom was from Hawaii. I think they talk about that like way later in the book. But her dad is from Japan, but her mom was from Hawaii. And so he moved to America, met her mom, and that's kind of how their family started. But like all the kids, they've never known anything but just being American.
And just speaking mainly English too.
Yeah, speaking English, and they didn't even like follow hardly any Japanese traditions or anything outside of like just little pieces from her grandma and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's like a real culture shock to her in the sense because, I mean, I think just anybody that went through this experience, but also just her being so young and just having lived, just a quote like normal life. And then like, after, like you said, the bombing of Pearl Harbor changing everything for her, because then right around that time, which was something that was pretty common, was that the government started looking for people who they considered specifically like quote threats, people that they thought that were traitors to the United States. And so they started rounding up a lot of many of the men that were kind of in positions of power, what they seemed to be of organizations, of churches, of whatnot. And her dad is one of them that does get sent away, which
by the FBI, and he's like a fisherman. He's just a fisherman. They thought he was like giving like oil away to Japanese submarines or something like that.
Yeah, that's what they claimed. Yeah, the government claimed. So they brought him, and then they put him into what was kind of a different area. I'm trying to remember the exact word for it. More of a legit prison, which it was wild to say that like they was into a prison camp in North Dakota.
Yeah, and they're from like Southern California. Like that's where they lived. They took him far away.
Yeah, and I think it's called Fort Lincoln, which that place actually still exists today. And it's like a museum you can visit. And it's one of the interesting things is like their website does not talk about that they incarcerated people of Japanese descent there or anybody during the war that they thought was deemed a threat by them. Yeah. But because it had been used, like that particular location is a fort. So it's been used since like the Lewis and Clark expedition. But then because their father, and especially a lot of during that time, it's considered like, the male figure, the head of the household, the one who keeps the family together, gets the finances. Like, Jeanne had older siblings, and they all moved to a different area called Terminal Island, which was a huge, like, culture shock to her because she had never been around other people who were Japanese and Japanese Americans. Then that was a big deal because at the beginning of 1942, President Roosevelt made his Executive Order 9066, which said they're established an exclusion zone and deemed that people of Japanese descent were a danger and needed to be rounded up and put into hard-to-reach areas, into things that they deemed were called camps. So that also affected Jeanne and her family during this time, who had been in Terminal Island, and they were sent to one of the 10 internment camps. They were sent to Manzanar, hence the name of the book, Farewell to Manzanar. Now, I did mention at the beginning of the episode, like, I had family that was in Amache, so it's really interesting to find out where these other camps were. I'm not sure, Wade, if you're familiar with any of the other ones.
I'm not.
So Manzanar is located in California. It's like in the mountain area on like the eastern side of California. Amache is in the southeastern portion of Colorado. And there were two of them that were in Arkansas, that were Rower and Jerome. And what's kind of interesting, like what these areas are, like the mountains and like the very odd corners of different places, they wanted these to be like deserted areas, like middle of nowhere. There was like nothing around, just like barren land. The other camps include, like, relocation centers is also the name that the government gave them. They thought it was a nicer term, but it's unjust incarceration.
Yeah.
Yeah. There were 2 in Arizona, Gila River and Poston. Then you had one in Utah called Topaz. There was also another one in California, Tule Lake, and Heart Mountain in Wyoming, and Minidoka in Idaho. I think that's all 10 of them. So some of them were, yeah, as far east as Arkansas to still just on the eastern side of California. And before many were sent to these, like, main 10 locations, they were also sent to places that were called assembly centers. And I can't remember if she actually mentions this in the book or not. I think it's something that she kind of glosses over.
I want to say that she doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but I think, like, they get on a bus and that takes them to a place. And like, she recalls, like, I thought we were going to be living there, and like, and we could do these things, and it was kind of nice because I could see my friends, and even though, like, there wasn't any place to actually live, we all just kind of, like, stayed in this thing together, but they put them there so they could kind of, like, divvy them up.
Yeah. And these places, like to, like, really put them in perspective, a lot of these places were just, like, horse tracks or something, like barns and everything. Like, people were, like, living in stalls. Like, these weren't, like, full housing. Eventually, some of them, they started building kind of like barracks, but they were just bare boned, like, loosely put together, just, like, places. And then from there, then they were sent off to places like she is sent to Manzanar. And, like, these were like considered by military standards. They were just put together by the military of being, like, rough, like, literal barracks of just plain rooms, single light bulb, not very well placed. Like, there's no installation really, just, like, wooden buildings put together.
Holes in the wall. The walls don't come down all the way to the floor. Like, yeah.
And then they were just given a cot to sleep on and, like, a blanket. And, like, they had to find their own, like, kind of, like, stuffing and stuff for their pillows and everything, or like, their bedding, because they weren't given anything else.
And they had, like, a mess hall for food.
Yeah.
Like, they would be given food, like, off a truck, and they could eat in the mess hall, but there, like, wasn't space to go back to your little hole in the wall. I mean, it was because each family got one room, you know, of that barrack.
Yeah. And to clarify, like, family, like, the government chose how to divide you up, and that could include anything like your immediate family, or you could be sharing a room with, like, who knows, like, they were just open rooms, and all these people are supposed to live together, and so people had to get creative and make some type of thing, which also goes into detail that it really changes, like, the dynamic of all these families, because there was all, like, a sense of, like, community of being around a meal. That's something I think a lot of people are familiar with, and just, you know, having those time together as a family, but then being forced to, like, not have enough space of, like, basically just, like, where you sleep at, and then eating in mess halls, and then people just eating with other people, not necessarily their family, because they had friends and everything, and just, it really affected not just, like, mentally, emotionally, and just, it changed a lot of things for these families.
Yeah, and she talks a lot about that, like, from, like, the moment they got there, like, her family, who used to be super close, and all 9 kids and everything, and because they were forced together so much, they were forced to, like, to leave their little barrack so they could have space, where they met new friends, and, like, they wouldn't eat together anymore. Sometimes they couldn't eat together. You know, it was just, she talks a lot about how her family just started to split up, and they never really, she said it took them years afterwards to like, recreate those familial bonds and stuff like that.
Yeah, it just completely, like, shattered all those things that everybody were used to, and just changed their way of life. Like, and it shows, like, when people are thrust in this situation, people, you know, it's a terrible situation, and people just try to make the best of it. So, you know, she does talk about, you know, like, having fun and hanging out with friends and doing things, but, you know, they have to make the best, like,
it's, like, within the lens of this.
Yeah. And I mean, she's also so young too, and, like, children, like, this is, like, you just can't fully imagine what that being like. Just, and fully understanding, because like she even talks about in the book, like, because book is written in the 70s and she's clearly like much older than she was in the 40s, and it's just more of her also just like looking at her life in a different lens, just reflecting and also commenting about like, this is actually what was going on during this time, or, you know, this was happening. And it's just, which I also think is a really interesting way to look at this book too, because it's not just like simply saying like, you know, what's happened. It's her reflecting on what her thoughts were at the time, but also reflecting on, now that she's older, realizing more of what was happening.
And it's just, and it's such a mess because, I mean, this lasted what, like 2 years? Something around that, 3 years.
Yeah. It was like 42 to 45.
In that time though, like whatever people had before they were taken, it was gone. The government claimed it. If they had businesses, property, whatever, like it was not there when they were allowed to come back. Like the older people, like the first, second generation people, they weren't allowed to be citizens even. Like they had no protections anyway. So like the kids who were born in America, you know, they were American citizens, so they had something that they could kind of rely on, but like their parents, they had nothing. There was no protection given to them because they weren't allowed to be citizens of the country. There was no test they could take. There was nothing. Mm-hmm. So she talks a lot about how difficult it was, like, for her parents when they finally were able to leave, and like they never fully recovered. Like her parents specifically, because they were just so old at that point. They had nothing to go back to.
Yeah, exactly, because they were so old. Like, because her parents, like her dad specifically, had chosen to like make a life in the United States, had really worked up, had really, you know, tried to save up, make a living, be able to support a family. And then when they were sent off to Manzanar, like they also couldn't bring that many things with them. And it's also really unfortunate. There's also other stories where like they would ask like a neighbor or friends and families. There would be people who would be like, hey, can you like take care of our house or our land while, like, you know, the area where we live while we're gone, or hold on to our stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of families lost stuff because their houses became ransacked or destroyed, or like the areas they had been living had been taken over by other people. And you're right, like, so after the government just uplifts these people, tells them to get rid of all their stuff, and then says, okay, go back into the world.
And it was like, what, like 110,000 people? It wasn't like a small amount of people. It was tons.
Mm-hmm. A significant portion, and then just have them try to reassimilate to society after spreading hate and lies and everything, saying they're all traitors, and then saying, good luck.
Right, because like when she talks about how like when she was able to leave and she was able to go like back to school and stuff, like the amount of racism that she faced like after that was just utterly like sickening, which she didn't have to face any before because nobody looked at her differently. And then after the war, it was just, she was never included in anything. Like she wasn't even allowed to be a part of like her local Girl Scouts troop.
Oh my gosh, that really got to me. I could not believe that.
Like it was the stupidest little things, and it's just because of, you know, casual racism.
And just, outright,
that everybody just held on to for so long.
Yeah. But it's also something interesting too, and I think it's like she gives so many like I think any memoirs, like it's just amazing what people are willing to share and like have the world read, and just like, you know, this isn't some like shiny, like, you know, happy story of like bad to good and everything. Like she covers everything. She talks about like the difficulties within her family and the struggles, and how her dad was not really a great person and was abusive and everything, and had to live with that, and how the conditions in living in Manzanar made those things a lot worse for her family, and that, you know, there's struggle and things and her feelings about dealing with other people and differences. And it's just, and this is something too that, I mean, yeah, like we said, this affects like, you know, like over 100,000, 120,000 plus people, like, and I think for like this to be like one of the main big stories that are out about this, like this is something a lot of people kept hidden, didn't want to talk about it. I mean, it's understandable to be such like a terrible situation to be in and not want to talk about it, but people also being brave enough to share their stories so that people know about this part of history that many may not know of.
It's in the fact that we did this like on our own soil to our own people. It's just because I like she talks about it in the book, but there's a huge court case, and I can't remember who it was who brought it to the courts, but this man was like, this is not happening to German Americans, to Russian Americans, to Italian Americans. This isn't happening to any of them. So why is this only happening to Japanese Americans? Mm-hmm. Like, why are they the enemy specifically, when the vast majority of the people that were taken are American citizens, natural American citizens?
And the fact in the beginning, the the courts were like, it's justified. It's wartime.
It's
Things
fine.
need to be done. Yeah.
You got to do what you got to do.
I'm like, no, not cool. And like, yeah, because there was more than one person who stood up and tried to fight in the courts. And then eventually the courts towards the end of the war, I believe that's specifically when they said like, okay, yeah, I guess we don't need to be doing these anymore. Yeah.
Like, it's fine.
Yeah. And then it became kind of more like, oh, let's quickly erase the stain in our history. Let's get these people out of these places. Like, go back, like, to your homes that no longer exist and go out into the world and find a new job, find some place that will allow you to live there. Because that's another thing, too. Like, it was restrictions not only on, like, people of Japanese descent, like especially like, yeah, the first generations, those who came over and everything, like being able to become citizens, but also there were restrictions on like if you could own property, like where you lived, like almost like having permission because of all the racism and just things like that. And then yeah, like erasing everything. So like once like they were quickly trying to get like everyone out of all these like camps, then they started like destroying them. So like today, there's not really much out there if you go to any of these locations that shows like these places existed. There might be places where you can go where there might be like a little bit of a foundation and stuff. Like some of the land is like owned by like, it's private now. Like people use it for farmland. Like for example, in Arkansas, like where the two were located, most of it is considered farmland. There's like a little bit of part that has like a plaque that says like this, like recognizing this was once there. There are some, though, that are fortunate to be a part of the, like, Park Service, the National Park Service. Like, Amache, for example, just became a National Historic Site. And so, like, some of them have, like, rebuilt, like, one of the barracks so that you can go inside and you can truly see, like, how people were forced to live during this time and, like, how truly small they were. But there's some, for example, too, which is also an interesting part of history, is that, like, in Arizona, Gila River is considered to be a part of, like, Gila River, like, Indian reservation.
Oh.
So our government
they
took land from...
Oh, they took land from those
the
areas
indigenous people
to do that? Oh my gosh.
And then put people there.
Let's just double up then. It's fine.
Yeah. It's just...
We're being racist. Let's be real racist.
Yeah.
My gosh.
And just so many things like that. But yeah, like a lot of those things, yeah, there's like nothing there. But...
Well, I love the fact that at the end of the book, she like, you know, and she's like her early 40s, I think, at this point, where she takes her kids and her husband to the site of Manzanar, where she's like finally ready to like talk to her, like her oldest kid about it, who's only like 11 or something like that, I think.
Yeah.
But they take their kids there, and she's finally able to like kind of let go of all of that trauma and fear and stuff that she had when she was a little kid.
Yeah. And I think because that was also something really interesting, I thought, in this book, because she talked about how they got to go like camping. They had their privileges to allow to leave outside, because a thing mentioning too, who may not be familiar, like all these places were surrounded by barbed wire. There were guard towers, like with guards with guns pointed inside, ensuring people didn't leave, except for the few occasions they were allowed to leave, because they eventually allowed some of them to work jobs, or as she explains in the book, to like go camping for a night in the creepy part of the mountains.
Yeah, right. Stories. My gosh, yeah.
I was like, oh no.
That was unsettling. That was a part.
Yes, it was. I was like, oh no. And like, you dare to go further into the mountains? I'm like, no, please don't. That sounds concerning. But I don't know. I think just like so I'm curious your thoughts. Like, wait, because you said you read this when you were in school, and then you read it again now. Like, were there things that, I don't know, like How was it, like, reading it again after all these years?
It reminded me of what was in the book, because it's been quite a while. But the whole time I listened to it on audiobook, and just the whole time it just brought back those same, like, somber feelings of just bewilderment that people could have just let this happen. Like, things got so bad as far as, like, their own, like, racially charged fears and stuff like that, and pushing national security a little too far and things like that. Just in the amount of, like, attempted brainwashing they tried to do during that time period too. Like, you know, they were trying to, like, gaslight these, like, the poor Japanese Americans into saying that they were still loyal to Japan and stuff. But it's like, these people were not. They had never been. Most of them didn't even know if they had family in Japan. It was like they were trying to just push these ideals so heavily, like, well, you have to be, though, right? Like, you must have some kind of loyalty to your emperor, things like that. It's just like, that is just, it's messed up.
Yeah, it was one of the books that, like, because, like I said, I only had to read an excerpt in school. It was always one of those books that I was like, I would eventually like to read because I've heard so much about it. And just reading it now and just, like, knowing a little bit more about this part in our history, it's just crazy and just, I don't know, it just leaves me speechless. It's just, like, so, sad and just, but just amazing how much she's, like, was willing to share about her life. And just, I think having memoirs like this and stuff are so important, because I think also, like, I remember, like, in elementary school, middle school, high school, like, there were also other memoirs about, you know, people that were in concentration camps in Europe that were affected by the Holocaust and everything. There are other books too that, like, that make these things so much more real. Like, having that, like, real person connection to this, like, really shows that, like, these things happened and this is an actual human being that experienced these, and, like, it's not okay. And, you know, because I think that's something to just reflecting, like, learning history in school. I think sometimes I always feel like, you know, sometimes there's, like, it might be a little boring or there's that disconnect, but then just being able to have, like, specific, like, people and their stories, like, connected to it.
These are the things that teach sympathy and sometimes empathy, if you have a more personal connection to it. But these are the kinds of emotions that history should invoke, like pride for a country or a nation or a people. Like, those things are good and they're useful, but it's these things, these awful things that happen in history. They teach us what not to do, what not to get close to, and that's a lot, especially, like, these days. I feel like kids don't take those things to heart as much, because the world now is such a small place for them with the access to everything that they have access to. It's just they don't get the same kind of thing, I think.
Yeah. And, like, related to this topic, like, you know, this is, like, an actual novel that's a memoir, but I have seen in recent years, like, covering the same subject, there have been graphic novels about this, like, different ways of trying to either meet those younger audiences or other people to...
Absolutely.
Because, in fact, there's specifically one called They Called Us Enemy, which was co-written with George Takei, and it is based on his experiences. So, speaking, because we are basically, like, a nerdy podcast and everything, but we do cover, you know, books, but also, like, saying, like, George Takei, many people might know him from his role in Star Trek. And he has been outspoken on a variety of topics, and he was imprisoned in Arkansas. And so actually at that, which I think is Rower, and then went to Tule Lake after that. And so he actually, like, invested as part of, like, one of the experiences actually in Arkansas. I gotten a chance to visit both of those locations there, and there are different, like, kiosks that talks about, like, the land and, like, what was where and everything, because there's nothing there, it's just farmland. And he actually has, like, audio recordings you could listen to him describing what he remembers as a child there, as also just That's, like, an interesting connection. But I don't know if you had gotten a chance to read anything else, because one of the other books that I read was called Gasa Gasa Girl Goes to Camp, which Gasa Gasa kind of means, like, restless, which kind of describes, so this author, her name is Lily Yuriko Nakai Havey. I was really excited to get this book. I got this for Christmas because she also was in Amache, so just having that extra connection, like, with my family being Inamachi as well, and just like hearing her. This was a really interesting book because she's an artist, so she also reflected on her experience because she was also a child, like in her like 10, 11, 12, like early like preteens, and so a lot of her artwork, like watercolors, are her just reflecting on her time in Amache, and just they're like these really unique abstract like combination of all these images of just her raw feelings. And then she started writing more about her specific stories, and like she goes into a lot of detail in this book. Like this book is also like, it's a heavy topic, but she's also like funny. Like this is like a real person, a real child. Like she's
dealing with the trauma with a little bit of humor.
Yeah, I mean, she's a child, so she's also not like a, little like goody two-shoes or anything. She's more of like a little rebellious and being like, I don't want to do that. Ew, no. Like, and just like causing mischief and stuff. So it was really I don't know, it's bad to say like a joy to read this, but it was just really nice to just read another story about this, and one where also includes art as well into it, which was really interesting.
Well, I'd really like to read the Takei book. I've had it on a wish list for quite a while. I just haven't gotten around to pick it up. But after this episode, in rereading Farewell to Manzanar, I might need to.
It's one I've never read either, but definitely it's one that's been on my watch list for a while. And there's so many other ones that have come out recently too. I might as well just name a few for our listeners if you're curious about picking up any of these books or anything. Another graphic novel is called We Hereby Refuse. There's also like No Boy, which that was a big deal, which I think you kind of mentioned, Wade, about how there was a big questionnaire that became a big deal, and there were people who were considered...
Yes, no.
Yes.
No, yes.
Yeah.
No.
Which is just so insulting. You're already in that position, and to be like, will you hereby like forever and always never like be like revoke your citizenship to Japan, and then being like, will you fight in the military? And there were, which rightly so, they're already imprisoned in the situation, and then being like, we need you, like, you better say yes, because if you say no, they're gonna round you up. And a lot of people then got sent off to what was considered more of the hard labor, the hardcore intensive location for defying the government.
And in this book, she goes into that a lot because her oldest brother was issued this survey, and he was like, well, maybe I should join the American Army, maybe I should join the military, maybe that'll help our family out, and maybe they'll let us go. And her dad was like, you're stupid, because he didn't. But I mean, as we've said, her dad was kind of not great. But he was like, you can't say yes, because then like the more rowdy people here in the camps, like they'll kill you for thinking you're some kind of traitor. To what exactly? Nobody can really say, because like, again, like these were just normal people. Nobody was like for Japan. But I love the way that like she talked about how her dad would talk about it, and like, because they would always ask like, who, like, is your loyalty with Japan? Is your loyalty to America? Well, it has to be this way, right? Surely, because you're Japanese. And her dad said something about the fact like, well, does your mom and dad argue at home? When they argue at home, do you want them to kill each other, or do you just want them to stop fighting? Like that, the way that they talk about that in the book is because her dad is the only person who really has any kind of, I guess, loyalty to Japan, because like his family still lives in Japan. Not that, and they get to the point of the book where they actually think he's dead, so it doesn't matter to them anyway. But because like he never gets to go back to visit, and they just like once he leaves for America, they're just kind of like, he's dead to us anyway, so it's whatever. But yeah, her brother is issued this kind of ultimatum in a sense too, and I think he does eventually join the military.
Yes,
like after the fact, like they all get to like go home, but he goes off to join this branch, and like another brother goes off to join this branch, I think, or maybe like one of her sister's husbands goes off or something like that. I don't remember.
Yeah, no, that's true. And mentioning like the military too, because like I think I've actually mentioned it on the podcast before, because there was another book I had read last year Facing the Mountain by Daniel James Brown, which was about the 442nd Regiment, which was the Japanese American regiment, which was the most decorated regiment in World War II. And so that with also, there was, I think it was the 100th Battalion out of Hawaii. And I think it just adds to that with like her brother and Farewell to Manzanar just, wanting to prove their loyalty and show like, they are American. They're supporting Americans in the war and they're fighting for their country. Anyway, that's another book. And then, because there's a lot of books that are like memoirs and autobiographies and stuff. There's one book that is probably one of my favorite books ever. It's called Hotel in the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, which is actually a work of fiction, but it also details that with a Chinese American man and a Japanese American woman and their stories from their childhood and their separation due to World War II and her incarceration, and then their like meeting up years later and reflecting on their lives and all their changes and stuff like that. It is a bittersweet story.
That sounds like it.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I think I like cried nonstop in like the third half of the book. Like it's just an intense story and just, yeah. But it's a really well done book, which that author is Jamie Ford, and he's written a couple other books as well. But I definitely think I've seen so much more books and people who have family connections and whatnot, just, telling their stories, telling more about these historical moments. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot out there, and we'll post some of this on social media. We'll post the books that we read and everything, and pictures, and listeners, you can let us know if you've ever heard any of these, if you've read them, or if you are interested in reading some of them, or if there are ones that we missed that you would like us to check out as well.
or if your family has some kind of tie-in to what we're talking about today. Like, tell us your stories, tell us your thoughts on the matter, share with us all of these things.
Yeah. But listeners, thank you for listening to this episode. We know it was, more of a darker, serious subject, but we hope you enjoyed it or learned something as well. And, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, we're going to be celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Month, so I will give a tease. Our next one will be slightly more lighthearted. We will be covering a movie. This movie was a pretty big movie that came out a couple of years ago, so listeners, you can also let us know if you can guess which very popular movie this is. So with that, as always, so you don't miss out on an episode, be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. And yeah, share this with a friend. And, follow us on our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PodDemastered. Send us an email at demasteredpodcast@gmail.com. As always, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, and we hope you tune in to the next one.